There I stood, watching my own grandson blow out his birthday candles while his mother deliberately positioned herself between us, ensuring I wouldn't appear in a single photograph. At 72 years old, after building an empire from nothing, after raising 2 successful sons as a widow, after pouring my heart and fortune into this family, I was being erased from their memories one snapshot at a time. But here's what my daughter-in-law didn't know about Grace Peterson. I didn't just build wealth, I learned how to wield it. And sometimes, the most powerful lessons come wrapped in consequences she never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Grace Peterson, and if you saw me walking down the street, you'd probably see what most people see: a well-dressed woman with silver hair, carrying herself with the confidence that comes from 7 decades of learning life's hardest lessons. What you wouldn't see is the empire I built from a tiny flower shop into a multi-million-dollar business, or the fact that I've been fighting battles longer than most people have been breathing. I never expected that my greatest battle would be fought in my own family's living room over something as simple as a photograph. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October when everything changed. The autumn light was streaming through the bay windows of my son David's colonial home, casting everything in that golden glow that makes ordinary moments feel magical. Little Tommy, my precious grandson, had just turned 5, and the house buzzed, with the controlled chaos that comes with children's birthday parties. 7 little ones ran around the backyard while parents clustered in the kitchen, nursing coffee and making small talk about school districts and soccer schedules. I'd arrived, early, as I always did, with my arms full of gifts and my heart full of anticipation. The bakery had outdone themselves with Tommy's dinosaur cake, and I'd spent weeks planning this day, coordinating with Sarah to make sure everything would be perfect for my grandson's special day. After all, 5th birthdays only happen once, and I believed in making them memorable. Sarah, my daughter-in-law of 8 years, greeted me at the door with what I now realize was a strained smile. She looked beautiful as always, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, wearing one of those effortlessly elegant outfits that made motherhood look like a magazine spread. But there was something in her eyes I couldn't quite read, a tension that seemed to vibrate just beneath her polished surface. "Grace, you're here," she said, taking the gifts from my arms. "Tommy's been asking about his grandmother all morning." The house smelled like vanilla cake and autumn spices, and I could hear my grandson's laughter echoing from the backyard. These were the moments I lived for now, the simple joy of being surrounded by family, of watching the next generation grow and thrive. After losing my husband Robert 5 years ago, these gatherings had become my lifeline, the bright spots that made the quiet evenings in my empty house bearable. I made my way to the kitchen where David was arranging drinks, his face lighting up when he saw me. At 34, my eldest son had grown into a handsome man who reminded me so much of his father. It sometimes took my breath away. The same warm brown eyes, the same gentle way of moving through the world, the same tendency to avoid conflict even when confrontation might serve him better. "Mom, perfect timing," he said, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like aftershave and contentment. "Tommy's been asking when Grandma Grace was coming with the big presents." I laughed, remembering the elaborate treasure hunt I'd planned for him to find his main gift, a vintage train set that had belonged to David when he was Tommy's age. "Well, we can't keep the birthday boy waiting, can we?" The party unfolded, beautifully for the first hour. I watched Tommy tear through his presents with the unbridled enthusiasm that only children possess, his eyes growing wide with each new discovery. The other children played games in the backyard while the adults shared stories and caught up on each other's lives. I found myself in my element, moving between conversations, ensuring everyone felt welcome, sharing stories about Tommy's latest adventures during our weekly visits. Sarah had outdone herself with the decorations. Dinosaur banners hung from the ceiling, and she'd created a whole prehistoric landscape on the dining room table, complete with toy volcanoes and plastic palm trees. It was the kind of attention to detail that made her such a wonderful mother, and I made sure to compliment her efforts throughout the afternoon. "Sarah, this is absolutely magical," I told her as we stood watching the children play. "Tommy will remember this forever." She smiled, but again, there was something distant in her expression. I just want everything to be perfect for him. As the afternoon wore on, the moment I'd been anticipating finally arrived. Time for the family photos. This had become our tradition at every birthday, holiday, and special occasion. The Peterson family portrait, capturing another milestone in our shared history. I'd already envisioned where this photo would go in my album, right next to the pictures from Tommy's 4th birthday, his first day of school, last Christmas morning. Sarah gathered everyone in the living room, arranging the children on the calm couch while the adults stood behind them. I naturally moved toward my usual spot, next to David, ready to put my arm around my grandson's shoulders. The photographer, a young woman Sarah had hired for the occasion, was adjusting her camera settings when Sarah's voice cut through the cheerful chatter. "Actually, Grace, would you mind stepping out of this shot?" The words hung in the air like a record scratch, bringing all conversation to an abrupt halt. I turned to look at Sarah, certain I'd misheard her. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" Sarah's cheeks flushed pink, but her voice remained steady. "I'd like to take some family photos, without you in them. Just the immediate family." The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel every pair of eyes watching this exchange, waiting to see how I would respond. David's face had gone pale, and I could see him opening his mouth to say something, but Sarah continued before he could speak. "It's nothing personal, Grace. It's just that we want some photos that are just us. David, Tommy, Emma, and me. The nuclear family, you know?" Nuclear family. The words hit me like a physical blow. After 8 years of being part of this family, after helping raise these children, after considering Sarah the daughter I'd never had, I was suddenly being categorized as something separate, something other. Little Emma, my 3-year-old granddaughter, looked confused by the sudden tension. She reached for me, as she always did, her small voice calling out, "Gamma Grace, come sit with me." "Emma, honey, Grandma's going to sit over there for a minute," Sarah said quickly, redirecting her daughter's attention. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a deep, burning hurt that started in my chest and radiated outward. In all my years of business negotiations, hostile takeovers, and boardroom battles, I'd never felt as diminished as I did in that moment, standing in my son's living room while his wife explained why I didn't belong in their family portrait. But I'm Grace Peterson, and Grace Peterson doesn't crumble in public. I've learned to school my features, to maintain my composure even when everything inside me is screaming. So I smiled, the same smile I'd used in 1,000 business meetings when someone underestimated me, and stepped aside. "Of course," I said smoothly. "I understand completely." David finally found his voice. "Sarah, I think—" "It's fine, David," I interrupted, my voice carrying just enough edge to let him know it was anything but fine. "Let's not make a scene at Tommy's party." The photographer, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama she'd just witnessed, quickly began snapping pictures. I watched from the side of the room as my family posed without me, their smiles looking forced and unnatural. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tommy kept looking in my direction, confused about why his grandmother was suddenly standing alone by the bookshelf. After several shots, Sarah seemed satisfied. "Perfect," she announced. "Now let's get some with the grandparents." But the damage was done. The message had been sent, loud and clear, in front of all the guests. I was not immediate family. I was not part of the inner circle. I was an add-on, an afterthought, someone to be included only when convenient. When it came time for the extended family photos, I posed dutifully, my arm around Tommy's shoulders, my smile never wavering. But inside, something had shifted. The warm affection I'd felt toward Sarah for 8 years had cooled into something harder, more calculating. The business side of my brain, the part that had built my fortune by reading people and understanding power dynamics, had fully awakened. The rest of the party passed in a blur of small talk and cake cutting. I played the role of the gracious grandmother, helping clean up, thanking Sarah for a lovely party, hugging my grandchildren goodbye. But I was operating on autopilot now, my mind already racing ahead to what came next. As I drove home that evening, my hands gripping the steering wheel perhaps a bit too tightly, I replayed the entire afternoon in my mind. This hadn't been a spontaneous decision on Sarah's part. The way she'd handled it, the specific language she'd used, the fact that she'd hired a professional photographer, this had been planned. She'd made a deliberate choice to exclude me, and she'd done it publicly, ensuring that everyone at that party understood exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. My house felt especially quiet that night. The silence that had become my constant companion since Robert's death seemed more oppressive than usual. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in my study, surrounded by the photographs that chronicled my life. Pictures of Robert and me on our wedding day, photos of David and his younger brother Michael growing up, snapshots from family vacations and holidays stretching back decades. On my desk sat the most recent family portrait, taken at last Christmas. We all looked so happy, so united. Sarah's arm was linked through mine, and she was smiling at me with what I'd believed was genuine affection. Had it all been an act? Or had something changed in the months since then? I thought about all the ways I'd tried to support Sarah over the years. When she and David were struggling to buy their first house, I'd quietly helped with the down payment. When Emma was born and Sarah was overwhelmed with 2 small children, I'd hired a cleaning service to come twice a week, telling Sarah it was a gift from a friend who preferred to remain anonymous. When Tommy needed speech therapy and their insurance wouldn't cover it, I'd found a way to pay for it without making them feel like charity cases. I'd always been careful to support them without overstepping, to be helpful without being intrusive. Or so I'd thought. Clearly, somewhere along the way, I'd miscalculated. Somewhere in my efforts to be the perfect grandmother and mother-in-law, I'd become something else entirely in Sarah's eyes. I'd become a threat. The next few days passed quietly. David called once, his voice careful and apologetic. "Mom, about the other day?" "There's nothing to discuss," I told him. "Sarah made her feelings clear and I respect her wishes." But it wasn't, she didn't mean, "David, honey, I'm not angry." And I wasn't, not anymore. Anger was a hot emotion, and what I was feeling now was much colder, much more focused. I just understand the situation better now. After I hung up, I sat in my study for a long time, thinking about power and family, about the ways we hurt each other and the ways we protect ourselves. Robert used to say that I had a gift for seeing the big picture, for understanding how all the pieces fit together. It was what made me successful in business, this ability to step back and analyze a situation objectively, to see not just what was happening, but why it was happening, and what might happen next. Sarah's actions at the party weren't really about photographs. They were about control, about establishing boundaries, about making sure everyone understood who was in charge of this family's narrative. She'd felt threatened by something, and she'd chosen to handle that threat by diminishing my role publicly. The question was, what was she threatened by? I spent the evening going through my calendar, looking at all the ways I'd been involved in my grandchildren's lives. I picked them up from school twice a week. I took them to the park on Saturdays. I attended every school play, every soccer game, every dance recital. When Sarah needed to work late or had appointments, I was her first call for babysitting. When the children were sick and couldn't go to daycare, they came to my house to recover. In other words, I'd made myself indispensable. And perhaps, in doing so, I'd made myself a threat. The realization came to me slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape I'd been too close to see clearly. Sarah wasn't threatened by my wealth, or my success, or my opinions about child-rearing. She was threatened by the simple fact that her children adored me, that when they skinned their knees, they wanted Grandma Grace's special Band-Aids, that when they had nightmares, they asked to call me, that when Sarah disciplined them, they would sometimes cry that they wanted to go to Grandma's house instead. I'd been so focused on being supportive that I'd never considered how my support might feel to a young mother who was already struggling with the normal insecurities that come with parenthood. In my eagerness to be involved, to be needed, to fill the empty spaces in my life since Robert's death, I'd inadvertently created a situation where Sarah felt she had to compete with me for her own children's affection. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a woman who'd spent her career reading people and understanding their motivations, and I'd completely missed the emotional dynamics in my own family. I'd been playing chess while Sarah was playing a completely different game, but understanding the game didn't mean I had to accept the rules she'd tried to impose. The public humiliation at Tommy's party had crossed a line. She'd chosen to make our conflict visible to others, to diminish me in front of my grandchildren and the other guests. That wasn't about protecting her role as a mother. That was about establishing dominance. And Grace Peterson doesn't submit to dominance. I walked to my safe that night and pulled out a folder I hadn't looked at in months, the documents outlining my estate planning. Pages and pages of legal language that boiled down to a simple truth. I had spent a lifetime building wealth, and I had absolute control over where that wealth would go when I was gone. For 8 years, I'd assumed that wealth would flow naturally to David and his family. They were my primary beneficiaries, set to inherit not just money, but the business I'd built, the properties I'd acquired, the investments I'd made. Sarah and the children would never want for anything. Their futures were secured by my lifetime of work. But inheritance isn't just about money. It's about values, about respect, about acknowledging the contributions of those who came before. If Sarah wanted to treat me as separate from the family, as someone whose presence was optional and whose feelings were irrelevant, then perhaps it was time for her to understand exactly what that separation might cost. I didn't make any changes that night. I'm not impulsive, and decisions about family and money require careful consideration. But I did something I hadn't done in years. I started making lists. Lists of every contribution I'd made to David's family, every bill I'd quietly paid, every crisis I'd helped them navigate. Not because I expected gratitude, but because I needed to understand the full scope of what was at stake. The numbers were staggering. Over the past 8 years, I'd quietly supported David's family to the tune of nearly $500,000. The down payment on their house, the private school tuition for Tommy, the new car when Sarah's old one died, the family vacations I'd paid for while pretending the trips were contests they'd won, the medical bills I'd covered, the investment account I'd started for each grandchild's education. None of it had been loans. All of it had been gifts, given, freely out of love and a desire to make their lives easier. But gifts given under false pretenses, under the assumption that I was valued as part of the family, could perhaps be reconsidered. That night, I called my attorney. Not to make changes, not yet, but to understand my options, to know what tools I had at my disposal if this situation continued to deteriorate. "Grace," Richard Patterson said when I explained the situation. He'd been my lawyer for 20 years, had helped me navigate the legal complexities of building and running my business. "Family disputes are never simple. Are you sure you want to involve financial pressure?" "I'm not involving anything yet," I told him. "I'm just making sure I understand all the variables." "Well, legally speaking, you have complete discretion over your estate. You can change beneficiaries, add conditions, redistribute assets. It's entirely up to you. But Grace, once you start down this path, it's very difficult to walk back. Family. Relationships are fragile things. Richard, my family relationship was damaged when my daughter-in-law decided to publicly humiliate me at my grandson's birthday party. I'm not starting anything. I'm responding to something that's already started. After we hung up, I sat in my study until well past midnight, surrounded by photographs and documents, trying to chart a course through this unexpected territory. I'd spent my entire adult life being strategic, thinking 3 moves ahead, understanding that every action has consequences and every consequence opens up new possibilities. Sarah had made her opening move at Tommy's party. She'd established that I was not immediate family, that my presence was conditional, that my feelings were secondary to her comfort. She'd done it publicly, making sure there were witnesses to my diminished status. Now it was my turn to move. But I wouldn't be hasty. I wouldn't be emotional. I would be Grace Peterson, the woman who'd turned a small flower shop into a business empire, the woman who'd raised 2 successful sons while building her career, the woman who'd learned that in life, as in business, respect isn't given. It's earned and maintained through strength. Sarah thought she understood the dynamics of our family. She thought she could control the narrative by controlling the photographs, by deciding who belonged and who didn't. What she didn't understand was that real power in a family, like real power in business, flows from contribution, from value created, from the ability to change lives for better or worse. Over the next few weeks, I would let her learn that lesson gradually. I wouldn't make dramatic gestures or ultimatums. I would simply begin to withdraw the support I'd been providing, quietly and systematically. I would let Sarah discover, month by month, exactly how much her family had depended on my generosity. And then, when she finally understood the true cost of excluding Grace Peterson from the family portrait, we would have a conversation about respect. The game had begun, and I intended to win. 3 weeks had passed since Tommy's birthday party, and I was beginning to see patterns I'd been blind to before. It's remarkable how clarity comes when you stop making excuses for other people's behavior and start paying attention to what they're actually showing you. Sarah's exclusion of me from those photographs hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been building for months. I was sitting in my morning room, the one that overlooks the garden Robert and I planted together 30 years ago, when the first memory surfaced with startling clarity. It had been back in July, during what should have been our regular Sunday dinner. For 3 years, every Sunday at 5 o'clock, David's family would come to my house for dinner. It had become sacred time, a tradition that anchored our week and gave me something to look forward to during the long stretches between visits. That particular Sunday, I'd spent hours preparing Tommy's favorite pot roast, had picked fresh vegetables from my garden, and had even made Sarah's preferred lemon cake from scratch. The dining room table was set with my good china, the way Robert always liked it for family dinners, and I'd arranged fresh flowers from the garden as a centerpiece. At 4:30, my phone rang. Sarah's voice was bright and apologetic. "Grace, I'm so sorry, but we're going to have to cancel dinner tonight. Emma's running a little fever, and I don't want to risk getting you sick." It was reasonable. It was considerate. It was exactly the kind of thing a thoughtful daughter-in-law would say. So I'd packed up the dinner, put half in the freezer, and eaten a quiet meal alone while watching the sunset from my kitchen window. When I'd called the next day to check on Emma, Sarah had cheerfully reported that the fever had broken and everything was fine. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Children get sick. Plans change. These things happen in families. But now, sitting in my morning room with 3 weeks of distance and a new perspective, I remembered something else about that day. Later that evening, while scrolling through social media, something I rarely did, but loneliness sometimes drove me to seek connection wherever I could find it, I'd seen a photo on Sarah's Instagram account. The whole family at a restaurant. Downtown, everyone smiling and healthy. The timestamp showed it had been posted just 2 hours after she'd called to cancel our dinner because Emma was sick. The caption had read, "Spontaneous family dinner out." Sometimes the best nights are the unplanned ones. At the time, I'd felt a small stab of hurt, but I'd rationalized it away. Maybe Emma had recovered quickly. Maybe they'd decided fresh air would help. Maybe the restaurant had been closer to urgent care if she'd taken a turn for the worse. I'd given Sarah every benefit of the doubt because that's what family does. Now I understood it differently. That Sunday dinner cancellation hadn't been about Emma's health. It had been about creating a boundary, about establishing that their family unit could exist independently of me. The Instagram post had been a message, whether conscious or not, that they were perfectly capable of having wonderful family moments without Grace Peterson present. Once I recognized the pattern, other incidents began falling into place like puzzle pieces I'd been too close to see clearly. The weekend camping trip they'd taken in August without mentioning it until after they'd returned. The family day at the beach in September that I'd only learned about through Tommy's excited recounting 3 days later. The quiet family dinner at David's house last month where I'd driven by coincidentally and seen all the cars in the driveway, the warm light spilling from the windows while I sat alone in my car feeling like an outsider looking in at my own family. Each incident, by itself, had been explainable, forgivable, the kind of innocent oversight that happens in busy lives. But together, they formed a clear picture of gradual exclusion, of boundaries being drawn around their family circle with me increasingly on the outside. The most painful realization was how expertly Sarah had managed this process. She'd never been cruel or obvious about it. There had been no dramatic confrontations, no harsh words, no moments where she'd directly told me I wasn't welcome. Instead, she'd used the gentle art of redirection, the soft violence of scheduling conflicts, the quiet power of simply not including me in plans until it became natural for their family to function without me. I thought about the psychology of it, the careful calculation required to orchestrate such a subtle campaign. Sarah was intelligent. She had a master's degree in communications, after all, and she understood how to manage relationships and control narratives. She'd been strategic about this, patient, willing to play a long game to achieve her goal of repositioning me from essential family member to occasional visitor. The question that haunted me was why. What had I done to threaten her so profoundly that she'd felt the need to systematically minimize my role in her children's lives? When had I crossed whatever invisible line she'd drawn, and how had I remained so oblivious to her growing resentment? I spent that morning walking through my house, really looking at it for the first time in months. Robert and I had bought this place when David was just a toddler, had spent decades turning it into exactly the kind of home where children would want to spend time. The playroom on the second floor still held toys from when David and Michael were young, but it had been refreshed over the years with new games and books for Tommy and Emma. The kitchen had a step stool permanently positioned by the counter so little hands could help with baking. The backyard had a swing set, a sandbox, and a small garden plot where the grandchildren could plant their own flowers each spring. This house had been designed around the assumption that I would be an integral part of my grandchildren's lives, that they would have memories of baking cookies with Grandma Grace, of summer afternoons in the garden, of cozy winter evenings reading stories by the fireplace. I'd never questioned that assumption because it had seemed natural, inevitable. I was their grandmother. Of course I would be central to their childhood experience, but Sarah had been questioning it, apparently for quite some time. And she'd been taking steps to change the narrative without ever consulting me or giving me the opportunity to address whatever concerns she might have had. The phone rang around 10 that morning, interrupting my brooding. It was my younger son, Michael, calling from Seattle where he worked as a software engineer. Michael had always been my more direct child, the one who said what he thought without worrying about hurt feelings or social niceties. "Mom, David told me what happened at Tommy's party," he said without preamble. "What the hell is Sarah's problem?" I'd been wondering when this conversation would happen. David and Michael talked regularly, and I'd assumed word would get back to him eventually. It's complicated, sweetheart. It's not complicated, it's bullshit. You've been nothing but generous to that family, and she has the nerve to exclude you from family photos in front of other people? Michael's anger was gratifying, but it also made me realize how much I'd been minimizing Sarah's actions, even to myself. Hearing someone else's outrage helped me understand that what had happened at Tommy's party really had been as inappropriate as it had felt in the moment. I think Sarah feels threatened by my relationship with the children, I said carefully. She's trying to establish clearer boundaries around her nuclear family. By publicly humiliating you? Mom, that's not boundary setting. That's power playing. And frankly, it's stupid. Does she not understand how much you've helped them over the years? That was the question, wasn't it? Did Sarah understand the extent of my financial support, or had I been too subtle in my generosity? I'd always prided myself on helping without making people feel indebted, on finding ways to support David's family that preserved their dignity and independence. But perhaps in being so discreet, I'd made it easy for Sarah to take my contributions for granted, to see them as somehow her due rather than as gifts given out of love. Maybe it's time she learned, Michael continued. Maybe it's time for some natural consequences. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about natural consequences, a concept I'd used frequently when raising my own children. The idea that people learn best when they experience the direct results of their choices, when they have to live with what they've created, rather than being rescued from uncomfortable situations. Sarah had made a choice to exclude me from her family's inner circle. She'd been systematic about it, deliberate, strategic. She'd treated my feelings as expendable and my contributions as invisible. Perhaps it was time for her to experience the natural consequences of those choices. I spent the afternoon in my study, looking through financial records and making notes. Over the past year alone, I'd quietly covered Tommy's speech therapy sessions when their insurance claim was denied. $4,000. I'd paid for Emma's preschool registration fee when David mentioned they were having a tight month. $1,500. I'd arranged and paid for their family vacation to Disney World last spring, disguising it as a promotional prize they'd won. $8,000 including airfare, hotel, and spending money. There were dozens of smaller things, too. The organic groceries I had delivered to their house monthly, always with a note saying they were gifts from various made-up promotions or contests. The toys that appeared in the children's rooms, which I'd tell Tommy and Emma were from the toy fairy who visited when children were especially good. The monthly contribution to their mortgage that I'd arranged through their bank, structured to look like an automatic refinancing benefit rather than assistance from me. I'd created an entire infrastructure of support around David's family, and I'd done it so subtly that they'd come to see their comfortable lifestyle as the natural result of David's engineering salary, rather than as the product of my ongoing generosity. It had taken considerable creativity and planning to help them while allowing them to maintain their pride and independence. But pride and independence were luxuries that Sarah apparently felt comfortable weaponizing against me. She'd been willing to use my own discretion against me, to treat my careful generosity as evidence that I was unnecessary rather than as proof of how much I cared. That evening, I made the first change. I called the organic grocery service and canceled the monthly delivery to David's house. It was a small thing, barely noticeable in the grand scheme of their monthly expenses, but it was a beginning. If Sarah wanted to establish that I was not immediate family, then perhaps it was time for her to understand what that actually meant. The next morning, I canceled the automatic mortgage contribution. This one would be more noticeable, an extra $600 they'd have to find in their monthly budget, but it wouldn't create immediate crisis. It would just make things slightly tighter, slightly more stressful. They'd have to pay attention to their spending in a way they hadn't needed to for the past several years. I wasn't acting out of spite or revenge. I was simply withdrawing support that had been given under false assumptions. I'd been supporting their family because I'd believed I was part of it, because I'd thought my contributions were valued and my presence was welcomed. If those assumptions were incorrect, then the support needed to be reevaluated accordingly. Over the following week, I made several more adjustments. I closed the education savings accounts I'd been funding for Tommy and Emma, transferring the money into accounts they couldn't access. I canceled the life insurance policy I'd taken out with David's family as beneficiaries. I stopped the monthly transfer to the emergency fund I'd been building for them without their knowledge. None of these changes would create immediate hardship, but together, they would gradually shift their financial reality. They would have to start living within David's actual salary rather than within the enhanced lifestyle my contributions had made possible. They would have to make choices about priorities and spending that they hadn't faced since the early years of their marriage. I was curious to see how long it would take them to notice, and what Sarah's reaction would be when she realized that excluding me from the family might have costs she hadn't anticipated. The answer came sooner than I'd expected. 2 weeks after I'd started making changes, David called with a note of concern in his voice. "Mom, I'm probably being paranoid, but I wanted to ask you about something. Our bank called to say there was an issue with our mortgage payment system. Apparently, some automatic benefit we'd been receiving was discontinued. Do you know anything about that?" I kept my voice carefully neutral. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're asking, David." "Well, it's just that our mortgage payment went up by $600 this month, and the bank said it was because some kind of assistance program had ended. But we never applied for any assistance programs. It's been like this for years, so we just assumed it was part of our original loan terms." "That does sound confusing," I agreed. "Have you spoken to a loan officer about reviewing your account?" "Yeah, I have an appointment next week. It's probably just a paperwork error." "But Mom, if for some reason if you've somehow been involved in our mortgage payments, I need to know. We can't accept that kind of help without discussing it first." There it was, the pride I'd been trying to protect, the independence I'd been trying to preserve. David was a good man, raised with strong values about earning his own way in the world. The fact that I'd been able to help him for years without him realizing it had been a source of satisfaction for me. I'd managed to support my family while allowing them to maintain their dignity. But now Sarah's actions were forcing this conversation, bringing everything into the open in exactly the way I'd been trying to avoid. "David, your financial arrangements are between you and your bank," I said gently. "If there are questions about your mortgage, I'm sure your loan officer will be able to clarify everything. But Mom, sweetheart, I think it's wonderful that you want to handle your family's finances independently. That shows real maturity and responsibility." After we hung up, I sat in my study feeling the weight of what I'd set in motion. This wasn't just about money, of course. It was about power dynamics and family relationships, about respect and boundaries, about the invisible threads that hold families together and the ways those threads can be deliberately severed. Sarah had wanted to establish that I was not immediate family, that my role in their lives was optional and conditional. She was about to learn that my support had been just as optional as my presence, and that the two were more interconnected than she'd realized. The grocery delivery cancellation was noticed next. Sarah called, her voice puzzled but still friendly. "Grace, the strangest thing happened. You know those monthly grocery deliveries we've been getting? The ones from that organic company? Well, they stopped coming, and when I called to ask about it, they said the promotional program had ended. But I could have sworn the original notice said it was a year-long program and it's only been 8 months. How odd," I said. "Perhaps you could call back and speak to a manager." I did, but they were very vague about it. They kept referring to some kind of corporate sponsorship that had been discontinued. It's not a big deal financially. We can cover our own groceries, obviously, but the kids really loved some of those specialty items. Tommy keeps asking about those organic apple juices that came in the boxes with the cartoon characters. I felt a small pang at that. Tommy had indeed loved those apple juice boxes, had always run to show me the different cartoon characters when I'd visit. But I pushed the feeling aside. Sarah had made her choice about my place in the family, and choices have consequences. "I'm sure you'll find something else he likes just as much," I said. "Of course. It's just strange, you know? All these little changes happening at once. David's dealing with that mortgage thing, and now this. It feels like someone's playing games with us." There was something in her tone, a hint of suspicion that made me wonder if she was beginning to connect the dots. Sarah was intelligent, and she understood systems and patterns. It wouldn't take her long to realize that all these coincidences had something in common. "Life does seem to come in waves sometimes," I agreed. "How are the children doing?" "They're fine. Actually, Tommy keeps asking when he's going to see Grandma Grace again. I told him you were probably busy with your own things." The casual cruelty of that statement took my breath away. She was using my own grandchildren as weapons now, letting them think I was too busy to see them rather than admitting that she'd been systematically limiting our contact. She was making me the villain in their story, the grandmother who'd lost interest in them, rather than the grandmother who'd been pushed away. "I would never be too busy for Tommy and Emma," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Of course not," Sarah said quickly. "I just meant that we don't want to impose on your schedule. We know how active you are with your business and social commitments." Another subtle repositioning. Another way of suggesting that I had other priorities that were more important than family time. Sarah was skilled at this, at the art of gentle manipulation that left her targets feeling off balance and uncertain. But I wasn't uncertain anymore. I was beginning to understand exactly what kind of game we were playing, and I was preparing to play it better than she was. The conversation ended cordially, but I could hear the questions in Sarah's voice, the growing awareness that something was shifting in ways she couldn't quite identify. She was starting to feel the ground moving beneath her feet, and she didn't like it. Good. It was time for Sarah to experience a little uncertainty, a little instability. She'd been comfortable making unilateral decisions about my role in the family because she'd felt secure in her position, confident that there would be no consequences for treating me poorly. She'd underestimated the interconnected nature of family relationships, the ways that emotional connections and practical support were woven together in patterns she'd never bothered to examine. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking about power and how it operates in families. In business, power relationships are usually clear and explicit. People understand the hierarchy. They know who makes decisions and who implements them. They recognize the consequences of challenging authority or failing to meet expectations. But in families, power is more subtle, more emotional, more complex. It flows through relationships and obligations, through shared history and future expectations, through the countless small ways we support and depend on each other. Sarah had been wielding emotional power over me, using my love for my grandchildren and my desire to be part of the family as leverage to control my behavior and limit my influence. She'd been effective at it too. For months, I'd accepted her subtle exclusions because I'd been afraid that challenging her would make things worse, that standing up for myself might result in even less access to Tommy and Emma. I'd allowed her to train me to accept less and less, to be grateful for whatever scraps of inclusion she chose to offer. But Sarah had made a critical error in her strategy. She'd assumed that I needed her more than she needed me, that my emotional investment in the relationship made me powerless to push back against her boundaries. She'd confused my restraint with weakness, my discretion with impotence. She was about to learn the difference. That weekend, I made several more changes to their support system. I canceled the children's swimming lessons at the private club, lessons I'd been paying for while letting Sarah believe they were included in some kind of community program. I discontinued the monthly car maintenance service that had been keeping David's vehicles in perfect condition. I closed the health savings account I'd been funding to cover their medical expenses that weren't fully covered by insurance. Each cancellation was small enough to be manageable, but together they were beginning to add up to real financial pressure. More importantly, they were starting to chip away at the comfortable lifestyle Sarah had come to take for granted, the sense of security and abundance that had allowed her to feel confident about excluding me from family activities. I was also making changes to my own routines, establishing new patterns that didn't revolve around my grandchildren's schedules. I joined a book club that met on Saturday mornings, the time I'd previously reserved for taking Tommy and Emma to the park. I enrolled in a painting class that met on Wednesday afternoons, when I'd usually been available for emergency babysitting. I started volunteering at the local historical society on Thursday evenings, which had been my traditional night for helping with homework and bedtime stories. None of these activities were obligations I couldn't reschedule if a true emergency arose, but they served an important psychological purpose. They established that I had a life independent of my role as grandmother, that I was not simply sitting at home waiting for Sarah's permission to participate in my grandchildren's lives. They also served as evidence, should anyone question my priorities, that I was actively building a fulfilling life that didn't depend on my family's inclusion. If Sarah wanted to suggest that I was too busy for Tommy and Emma, then I would make sure that suggestion had some basis in reality. The shift in my availability was noticed quickly. The next Tuesday, Sarah called asking if I could pick up Emma from preschool because her afternoon meeting was running late. "I'm sorry, but I'm not available this afternoon," I told her. "I have a volunteer commitment at the Historical Society." There was a pause. "Oh, I didn't realize you were volunteering there. Since when?" "I started last week. It's very fulfilling work." That's great, Grace. Really great that you're finding new interests." Her voice carried a note of surprise, as if she'd never considered that I might develop interests that didn't revolve around her family's needs. "I guess I'll have to ask David to leave work early." "I'm sure you'll figure something out," I said pleasantly. "Actually, while I have you on the phone, I wanted to ask about something else. Tommy's been asking about coming to spend the night." "At your house?" "We used to do that fairly regularly, but it's been a while, and I wasn't sure if you were still interested in having him over." This was interesting. Sarah was testing the waters, trying to understand whether my reduced availability was a temporary adjustment or a permanent change in our relationship dynamic. She was also, I suspected, beginning to realize that my free babysitting services had been more valuable than she'd appreciated when they were readily available. "I'd love to have Tommy spend the night," I said. "Let me check my calendar and get back to you with some dates that work." "Your calendar?" "Yes, my schedule has gotten quite full lately. I want to make sure I can give Tommy my complete attention when he's here." "Right, of course. It's just that we used to be able to plan these visits more spontaneously." "Things change," I said simply. That conversation marked a turning point. Sarah was beginning to understand that the grandmother who had always been available, always flexible, always accommodating, was becoming someone who required advanced planning and consideration. The woman who had rearranged her life around their family's needs was developing her own needs, her own priorities, her own schedule that had to be respected. It was a subtle but significant shift in the power dynamic. For the first time since I'd known her, Sarah was having to consider my convenience rather than simply assuming my compliance. The financial pressures were mounting too. David called. The following week, his voice strained with a kind of stress I hadn't heard from him in years. "Mom, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to give me a straight answer." "Of course, sweetheart." "Have you been helping us financially? More than we realized?" I took a long breath. This was the conversation I'd been expecting. The moment when the careful structure I'd built around their finances became impossible to ignore. "Why do you ask?" "Because everything is falling apart at once, and it doesn't make sense. Our mortgage payment increased, our insurance coverage changed. Expenses we thought were covered by various programs or benefits are suddenly our responsibility. It's like someone pulled a bunch of financial supports out from under us all at the same time. That does sound stressful. Mom, please, I'm not stupid. These aren't coincidences. Someone has been helping us, and now that help has stopped. If it's you, I need to know. We can't plan our budget or make decisions about our future if we don't understand our real financial situation. David was right, of course. He was an engineer, trained to think systematically, and the pattern was too obvious to ignore. Multiple financial benefits disappearing simultaneously could only mean one thing. They'd had a secret benefactor who had withdrawn support. David, if you're having financial difficulties, perhaps it's time to have a serious conversation with Sarah about your family's priorities and spending habits. Our spending habits haven't changed. That's what I'm trying to tell you. We're living the same way we've been living for years, but suddenly we can't afford it, which means we were never actually affording it. Someone else was making it possible. The pain in his voice was evident, and I felt a moment of regret for the position I was putting him in. David was a good man who prided himself on providing for his family. Learning that he'd been unknowingly dependent on outside support was undoubtedly a blow to his sense of competence and self-worth. But this conversation was necessary. David needed to understand the true cost of his lifestyle, and Sarah needed to understand the value of the support she'd been taking for granted. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them experience the natural consequences of their choices. I think you and Sarah need to sit down together and carefully review your finances, I said gently. Make a complete budget, track all your expenses, understand where your money is actually going. It's possible you'll find ways to reduce costs or increase income that you hadn't considered before. Mom. His voice was quiet now, almost defeated. How much? How much what? How much have you been contributing to our household? I need to know. We have children to think about, a mortgage to pay. I can't figure out our real financial situation if I don't know what we've lost. I felt the weight of this moment, the way it would change everything between us. Once this conversation happened, there would be no going back to the comfortable fiction that David's family was financially independent. The truth would be out, and we would all have to live with the implications. Over the past 5 years, I estimate my various contributions have averaged about $18,000 per year. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I began to wonder if the call had been dropped. 18,000, he finally said. That's an average. Some years more, some years less, depending on your needs and circumstances. Jesus, Mom. That's more than my car payment and insurance combined. That's Emma's preschool and Tommy's after-school program and half our grocery budget. I never wanted you to feel burdened by it. Burdened? His voice cracked. Slightly. Mom, how can I not feel burdened? We've been living a lie. I thought I was providing for my family, but I was only providing part of what they needed. The rest was coming from you, and I didn't even know it. This was the hardest part, seeing how my discretion had inadvertently damaged my son's confidence in himself. I'd been trying to help without hurting his pride, but I'd ended up creating a situation where his pride was built on a foundation he hadn't known was artificial. David, you are providing for your family. You have a good job, you work hard, you're a wonderful father and husband. The fact that I chose to supplement your income doesn't diminish your contributions. But it does, Mom, don't you see? Sarah and I have been making decisions based on false information. We chose our house, our lifestyle, our children's activities, all based on what we thought we could afford. But we were never actually affording any of it. You could afford it. I just made it easier. No, we couldn't. That's why everything is falling apart now. We're not living within our means, and we never have been. We've been living within your means, and we didn't even realize it. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with David trying to understand the scope and timeline of my financial support. and me trying to help him see that accepting help from family wasn't something to be ashamed of. But I could hear in his voice that he was struggling with feelings of inadequacy and deception, even though the deception had been entirely on my part and motivated by love. When we finally hung up, I sat in my study feeling the complex emotions that come with difficult but necessary conversations. I was sad that David was hurting, but I was also relieved that the truth was finally out. I was proud of how he was handling the revelation, but I was also concerned about how this would affect his marriage and his relationship with Sarah. Most of all, I was curious about what would happen next. Now that David understood the extent of my contributions, he would have to have a very different conversation with Sarah about their family's finances and priorities. She would have to confront the fact that the comfortable lifestyle she'd taken for granted had been made possible by the same woman she'd been systematically excluding from family photographs and gatherings. The irony was almost poetic. Sarah had wanted to establish that I wasn't immediate family, that my presence was optional and my contributions were unnecessary. She was about to learn that in the Peterson family, emotional support and financial support had always been inextricably linked, and that excluding one meant losing both. The game was no longer just beginning. We were well into the middle moves now, and the stakes were becoming clear to all the players. Sarah had made her opening gambit by excluding me from the family photos. I had responded by revealing the true cost of that exclusion. Now it was her turn to decide what came next. The phone call from David had changed everything, and I knew that within hours, Sarah would understand exactly what she was up against. I didn't have to wait long. The next evening, as I was reviewing quarterly reports from my business holdings, my phone rang with an urgency that cut through the quiet of my study. It was David again, but this time Sarah was with him. I could hear her voice in the background, sharp with anxiety, asking questions faster than he could relay them. When he put me on speaker, the tension in the room was so thick I could feel it through the phone line. "Grace?" Sarah's voice was strained, carefully controlled in that way people sound when they're trying not to cry or scream. "David told me about your conversation yesterday, about the financial support you've been providing." "Yes, I imagine that came as quite a shock," I said, keeping my tone neutral and professional. "In business, I'd learned never to show your cards too early, never to reveal the full extent of your position until you understand what the other party is willing to offer. We had no idea," she continued. "All these years, we thought we were managing our finances independently. We thought we were being responsible, living within our means." "You were being responsible with the resources available to you," I replied. "I simply chose to expand those resources without making it a burden for you to accept help." There was a pause, and I could hear Sarah and David whispering to each other, some kind of urgent negotiation happening just out of my hearing. When Sarah spoke again, her voice had taken on a different quality, more conciliatory, more careful. "Grace, we need to understand what's happening. David says all the support has stopped, and we're trying to figure out if this is a temporary situation or if we need to make permanent changes to our lifestyle." This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the conversation where all the cards would be laid on the table. Sarah was beginning to understand that her actions had consequences, that treating me as expendable had real-world implications for her family's security and comfort. "Sarah, the support I provided was always discretionary, based on my understanding of my role in the family and my desire to contribute to my grandchildren's well-being. When circumstances change, financial arrangements sometimes need to be reevaluated accordingly." "What circumstances?" David interjected. "Mom, what's changed?" I took a long breath, preparing to say things that had been building inside me for months, but had never been spoken aloud. "David, your wife has made it clear over the past several months that I am not considered immediate family. She's excluded me from family gatherings, canceled traditional visits, and publicly indicated that my presence in family photographs is unwelcome. I've simply adjusted my financial contributions to reflect this new understanding of my role. The silence that followed was deafening. I could picture them looking at each other, Sarah perhaps realizing for the first time that her subtle campaign of exclusion had been more obvious than she'd thought. David perhaps understanding that there had been tensions in his family that he'd been too willing to overlook. "That's not. I never said you weren't family," Sarah finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Actions speak louder than words, my dear, and your actions have been quite clear." "But the money," David said, his voice strained. "Mom, we can't just lose $18,000 a year overnight. We have obligations, commitments. Emma's preschool tuition is due next month. Tommy's enrolled in programs. We have a mortgage. And you'll figure out how to handle those obligations, just like millions of other families do every day. You're both intelligent, capable people with good jobs. I have complete confidence in your ability to manage your finances independently." I could hear Sarah crying now, soft sounds of distress that she was trying to muffle. Part of me felt sympathy for her situation, but a larger part of me felt something colder and more calculating. She'd gambled that she could control my role in the family without affecting the benefits that came with that role, and she'd lost that gamble. Now she was experiencing the natural consequences of treating relationships as if they existed in separate compartments, as if emotional support and practical support weren't fundamentally connected. "Grace, please." Sarah's voice was thick with tears now. "Can we talk about this? Can we work something out? I think there's been a misunderstanding." "What kind of misunderstanding?" "I never meant to make you feel unwelcome. Sometimes I feel like the children prefer you to me, and it makes me insecure as a mother. When I asked you to step out of those photos, it wasn't because I don't value you. It was because I needed to feel like the primary maternal figure in my children's lives." This was interesting. Sarah was offering me a glimpse into her motivations, admitting to feelings she'd probably never voiced before. But admissions made under financial pressure weren't the same as genuine apologies or real changes in behavior. They were tactical retreats, attempts to regain lost ground rather than acknowledgments of genuine wrongdoing. "I appreciate your honesty, Sarah, but feelings and actions are different things. Your insecurity about your role as a mother led you to take actions that systematically excluded me from family life. Those actions had consequences that you're now experiencing." "But we can fix this," David interjected. "We can work out better boundaries, better communication. We're family, Mom. Families work through problems together." "David, I'm not interested in working out boundaries that allow Sarah to control my access to my grandchildren based on her emotional comfort level. I'm 72 years old, and I've earned the right to have relationships with my family members that aren't subject to someone else's insecurities or power plays." The conversation continued for another hour, with David and Sarah alternately pleading, explaining, and trying to negotiate some kind of compromise that would restore my financial support while maintaining Sarah's control over family dynamics. But I wasn't interested in half measures or temporary truces. Sarah had shown me who she was when she thought she held all the power, and I had no interest in returning to a situation where I was dependent on her goodwill for access to my own grandchildren. When we finally hung up, I felt both exhausted and energized. Exhausted by the emotional weight of the conversation, but energized by the clarity that came with finally speaking my truth. For too long, I'd been walking on eggshells around Sarah, trying to preserve harmony at the expense of my own dignity and my rightful place in the family. Over the next few days, I began to hear from other family members. My sister Margaret called, having heard from David about the family crisis. My brother-in-law Paul reached out, offering to mediate if that would be helpful. Even Michael called, again from Seattle, this time with a more nuanced understanding of the situation and a clearer sense of what was at stake. "Mom, I've been thinking about this whole thing with Sarah," Michael said during our conversation that weekend. "And I keep coming back to the same question. What exactly does she want? Like, what's her end game here? It was a good question, one I'd been pondering myself. I think she wants to be the undisputed center of her nuclear family, without interference, or competition from anyone else, including me. But she also wants the benefits that come from being part of a larger, more resourced, extended family. So she wants to have her cake and eat it too. Essentially, yes. She wants autonomy without consequences, control without responsibility. And what do you want? That was a harder question. What did I want? I wanted to be valued and respected. I wanted my contributions to be acknowledged rather than taken for granted. I wanted my relationship with my grandchildren to be secure and unconditional, not subject to Sarah's moods or insecurities. I wanted to be treated like the family matriarch. I'd earned the right to be, not like a convenient auxiliary who could be included or excluded at will. I want a seat at the table that can't be taken away based on someone else's emotional weather, I finally said. Then don't give it back until you get that guarantee. Michael's advice was simple but profound. I'd spent so many years trying to be accommodating, trying to smooth over conflicts and maintain harmony, that I'd forgotten the power of simply saying no and meaning it. Sarah had been able to control my behavior because she'd correctly identified that I valued family peace more than I valued my own position within the family. She'd used my own priorities against me. But financial leverage was different. Money was concrete, measurable, impossible to ignore or minimize. When I withdrew my financial support, I wasn't making an emotional appeal that could be dismissed or negotiated away. I was creating a material reality that had to be addressed on my terms. That realization led me to my next decision. It was time to visit my attorney Richard Patterson again, not just to understand my options, but to begin implementing a more comprehensive strategy. Richard's office had always been a place of calm efficiency, wood-paneled walls lined with legal, texts and family photos that spoke to decades of successful practice. When I arrived for our appointment, he greeted me with the kind of warm professionalism that comes from years of friendship as well as business relationship. "Grace, you look like a woman with a plan," he said, as we settled into the leather chairs. In his consultation area, "I am, and I need your help to implement it properly." I spent the next hour outlining everything that had happened since Tommy's birthday party, the gradual exclusion I'd experienced, the financial support I'd been providing, and the current crisis that had emerged when I'd withdrawn that support. Richard listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, his expression growing, more serious as the full scope of the situation became clear. "This is more complex than a simple estate planning issue," he said when I'd finished. "You're talking about using financial pressure to change family dynamics, which can be effective but also risky. Once you go down this path, relationships can be permanently altered." "Richard, the relationships have already been altered. Sarah made sure of that when she decided to treat me as optional. I'm not changing the dynamic. I'm responding to changes she already made." "Fair enough. So what exactly are you hoping to accomplish?" I'd given this considerable thought. "I want to restructure my estate in a way that ensures my financial legacy serves my values and protects my interests, both during my lifetime and after my death. If Sarah wants to treat me as separate from her immediate family, then my estate planning should reflect that separation." Meaning? Meaning I want to create a structure where my financial support for David's family comes with conditions that protect my role as grandmother and ensure that my contributions are acknowledged and valued rather than taken for granted. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "There are several ways we could approach this. We could create a family trust with specific provisions about your role and access to the grandchildren. We could restructure your will to include behavioral requirements for inheritance. We could establish a foundation that controls charitable giving to causes you care about, including your family's well-being, but with you maintaining control over the distribution criteria." "Tell me more about the trust option." "A family. Trust would allow you to provide ongoing support to David's family while maintaining control over the terms and conditions of that support. You could specify requirements for how you're to be treated, what kind of access you expect to have to your grandchildren, even what kind of communication and respect you expect from family members. If those conditions aren't met, the trust distributions could be suspended or redirected. The idea was appealing. A family trust would formalize what had previously been informal arrangements, making explicit the connection between my financial support and my role in the family. It would also ensure that my expectations were clearly documented and legally enforceable, rather than subject to Sarah's interpretation or mood. What about my existing will and estate plan? We'd need to revise everything to reflect the new structure. Currently, David is your primary beneficiary, with provisions for the grandchildren's education and Sarah's security if something happens to David. We could maintain those basic intentions while adding the protections and conditions you're looking for. We spent the rest of the appointment discussing technical details and legal requirements. Richard would draft several options for my review, including a revocable family trust that would give me maximum control during my lifetime, and revised will provisions that would ensure my values and expectations continued to govern my estate, even after my death. As I drove home from Richard's office, I felt a sense of clarity and purpose I hadn't experienced in months. For too long, I'd been reactive, trying to manage Sarah's behavior through accommodation and hoping that kindness would eventually be reciprocated. But kindness without boundaries isn't kindness, it's enabling. And accommodation without respect isn't harmony, it's capitulation. Sarah had taught me an important lesson about power dynamics in families. She'd shown me that emotional relationships and financial relationships were interconnected, and that people who feel entitled to your emotional labor will also feel entitled to your financial resources. She'd demonstrated that taking the high road only works when the other person is also committed to treating you with dignity and respect. Now it was time for me to teach her a lesson in return. That evening, I called David. Our conversation was brief and focused. David, I wanted to let you know that I'm working with my attorney to restructure my estate planning. This will include new arrangements for ongoing support to your family, but with different terms and conditions than what we've had in the past. What kind of terms and conditions? Terms that protect my role as your children's grandmother and ensure that my contributions to your family are valued and acknowledged rather than taken for granted. Richard is drafting the specific language, and I'll share it with you when it's ready. Mom, this sounds so formal, so legal. We're family. Can't we just work this out between us? David, we are family. That's exactly why this matters so much. Family relationships should be based on mutual respect and genuine appreciation, not on one person's willingness to accept whatever treatment the other person chooses to give. The legal structure isn't about creating distance between us. It's about ensuring that our relationship has the foundation it needs to thrive. But what if Sarah can't agree to whatever conditions you're putting in place? Then Sarah will have made her choice, and she'll have to live with the consequences of that choice. Just like I've had to live with the consequences of her choices up until now. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in my study, surrounded by the photographs and mementos that chronicled my life, pictures of Robert and me building our business together, photos of David and Michael growing up, snapshots from family holidays and celebrations that stretched back decades. In all of those pictures, I looked happy and engaged, secure in my role as wife, mother, and eventually grandmother. I'd built a life around relationships and family connections, had structured my business success and financial planning around the assumption that I would always be part of a larger family unit that valued my contributions and welcomed my presence. Sarah had challenged that assumption, had forced me to confront the possibility that my place in the family wasn't as secure as I'd believed. In doing so, she'd inadvertently awakened a part of me that had been dormant for years. The part that knew how to fight for what I wanted, how to use strategy and leverage to achieve my goals, how to protect my interests even when that protection came at a cost to others. I'd spent so many years being accommodating and generous that I'd almost forgotten I had other options. Sarah's behavior had reminded me that kindness was a choice, not an obligation, and that my resources, emotional, financial, and otherwise, were mine to deploy as I saw fit. Over the next week, Richard and I refined the trust structure and will revisions. The family trust would provide ongoing support to David's family, but with clear requirements about my access to my grandchildren, my inclusion in family events, and the respect I expected to receive as the family matriarch. If those requirements weren't met, the trust distributions would be suspended until compliance was restored. The will revisions were more dramatic. Instead of leaving my entire estate to David with provisions for Sarah and the grandchildren, I was creating a more complex structure that gave me greater control over how my legacy would be used. Part of my estate would go into an educational trust for Tommy and Emma, but with provisions that I would maintain control over their access to those funds based on their relationship with me and their understanding of family values. Another portion would be designated for charitable giving, allowing me to support causes I cared about while also providing tax benefits. The remainder would go to David, but with conditions that protected my memory and ensured that my contributions to the family would be acknowledged and honored even after my death. The most significant change was a provision that would allow me to modify the distributions based on how I was treated during my lifetime. If Sarah continued to exclude me from family activities or treat my presence as optional, I could redirect portions of my estate to other beneficiaries, including Michael's future family, charitable organizations, or even establish scholarships in Robert's memory. It was a comprehensive restructuring that gave me multiple tools for protecting my interests and ensuring that my values would continue to influence my family even after I was gone. More importantly, it sent a clear message about the kind of behavior I was willing to accept and the kind of behavior that would have consequences. When the documents were ready, I invited David and Sarah to my house for a formal presentation. I wanted them to understand not just the legal specifics, but the emotional reasoning behind my decisions. This wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about creating a structure that would protect all of us from the kind of misunderstandings and power struggles that had led to our current crisis. They arrived on a Tuesday evening, both looking nervous and uncertain. Sarah had clearly been crying earlier, and David wore the expression of a man who was trying to hold his family together while navigating waters he didn't understand. I served coffee in my good china and arranged the documents on the dining room table with the same care I'd used for business presentations throughout my career. I want to start by saying that I love you both, and I love Tommy and Emma more than words can express, I began. Nothing I'm about to share changes that fundamental truth. But love without respect isn't sustainable, and respect requires boundaries and consequences. I walked them through the trust structure first, explaining how it would provide ongoing financial support while ensuring that my role in the family was protected and valued. David asked technical questions about the legal mechanisms, while Sarah sat in silence, her face growing paler as she began to understand the implications. "So if I don't agree to these conditions," Sarah finally said, "my children lose their inheritance?" "No, Sarah. If you don't agree to these conditions, you lose the privilege of making unilateral decisions about my role in my grandchildren's lives while still benefiting from my financial support. The children's inheritance is protected regardless, but your ability to control their access to me while depending on my generosity is over. But these conditions, requiring you to be included in all family gatherings, giving you veto power over major decisions about the children's education and activities, mandating specific amounts of time you get to spend with them, it's like you're trying to control our family through money." I looked at her steadily. This woman who had tried to control my access to my family through emotional manipulation and social pressure. "Sarah, You've been controlling my relationship with my grandchildren for months. You've canceled visits, excluded me from events, made unilateral decisions about my role in their lives. I'm not introducing control to this relationship. I'm making sure the control flows both ways. David was studying the documents, his engineering mind working through the details. Mom, this is incredibly complex, and it puts Sarah and me in a position where we're essentially employees of the trust rather than independent adults managing our own family. David, you are independent adults managing your own family. But if you want the benefits that come from being part of a larger, more resourced extended family, then that family membership comes with responsibilities and expectations. You can't have the financial advantages of being my son and daughter-in-law while treating me like an inconvenient stranger. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, with Sarah and David alternately objecting to specific provisions, asking for modifications, and trying to understand the full scope of what I was proposing. Some of their concerns were reasonable, and I agreed to have Richard make minor adjustments to address issues of implementation and timing. But the core structure was non-negotiable. If they wanted my ongoing financial support, they would have to accept that support came with expectations about how I was treated and what role I would play in my grandchildren's lives. If they couldn't accept those expectations, they were free to decline the support and manage their finances independently. When they finally left that evening, Sarah was openly crying, and David looked like a man who'd aged several years in a single day. I felt sympathy for their distress, but I also felt a deep sense of relief. For the first time in months, I'd been completely honest about my expectations and my limits. I'd stopped pretending that I was willing to accept whatever treatment Sarah chose to give me, and I'd created a structure that would protect my interests going forward. The ball was now in their court. They could accept the new terms and rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and clear expectations, or they could reject the terms and accept the consequences of true financial independence. Either way, Grace Peterson would no longer be taken for granted. The silence that followed my presentation of the trust documents stretched for 3 days. 3 days during which my phone didn't ring, my doorbell didn't chime, and the usual background hum of family communication went completely quiet. I used that time productively, reviewing my investment portfolio with my financial advisor, scheduling maintenance for my properties, and attending the Historical Society meeting where I'd volunteered to help catalog their manuscript collection. It was a strange kind of peace, this absence of family drama. For months, I'd been walking through my days with a low-level anxiety about when the next subtle exclusion would occur, when Sarah would find another way to diminish my role while maintaining plausible deniability. Now that everything was out in the open, now that the stakes were clear and the choices were explicit, I felt a calmness I hadn't experienced since before Tommy's birthday party. But I also knew this quiet was temporary. Sarah and David were processing what I'd presented, weighing their options, probably having intense conversations about their future and their values. The trust structure I'd created didn't just require them to change their behavior, it required them to acknowledge that their previous behavior had been unacceptable. That kind of admission is never easy, especially for someone like Sarah who prided herself on being reasonable and fair. The call came on Thursday evening, just as I was finishing dinner. It was David, his voice careful and measured in a way that told me he'd rehearsed what he was going to say. Mom, Sarah and I have been talking about your proposal. We understand your position, and we recognize that we need to make some changes in how our family operates. But we also have some concerns about the specific terms of the trust, and we'd like to discuss potential modifications. This was exactly what I'd expected. Sarah was too intelligent to reject my offer outright, but she was also too proud to accept it without trying to negotiate better terms. She wanted the financial security without fully accepting the behavioral requirements. I'm listening, I said. The main issue is the oversight provisions. Some of the language feels very intrusive, like you would have veto power over decisions that should be ours to make as parents. We're wondering if there's a way to structure this that protects your relationship with Tommy and Emma without giving you that level of control over our daily choices. I almost smiled. Sarah was revealing her hand here, showing that she understood exactly which provisions would limit her ability to manipulate my access to my grandchildren. The oversight provisions weren't meant to micromanage their parenting. They were meant to ensure that major decisions affecting my grandchildren's lives couldn't be made without my input. David, which specific provisions concern you? Well, the requirement that you be consulted before we make changes to the children's schools, their extracurricular activities, or their living arrangements. The mandate that you have a minimum number of hours per week with them, regardless of our schedules or commitments. The expectation that you be included in all family vacations and major celebrations. And why do those provisions concern you? There was a pause, and I could hear Sarah's voice in the background, coaching him on how to respond. When he spoke again, his words sounded scripted, because they don't leave room for normal family flexibility. What if we want to take a spontaneous weekend trip? What if the children's interests change and they want to try different activities? What if work demands or other commitments make it difficult to maintain the exact schedule the trust requires? David, in the 8 years I've known Sarah, has she ever included me in a spontaneous family activity? Has she ever prioritized my relationship with the children when it conflicted with her preferences? Has she ever demonstrated the kind of flexibility you're asking me to trust her with now? Another pause. Longer this time. Mom, we want to rebuild trust between all of us. But that has to work both ways. You can't create a legal structure that assumes we'll behave badly and then expect us to feel trusted and valued. This was Sarah's argument, filtered through David's more diplomatic voice. She wanted me to trust her future behavior while ignoring her past behavior, to give her the benefit of the doubt despite months of evidence that she would use any flexibility I offered to gradually erode my position again. David, trust is earned through consistent behavior over time. The trust structure doesn't assume you'll behave badly. It simply ensures that if you do, there will be consequences. If Sarah treats me with respect and includes me appropriately in family life, the oversight provisions will never come into play. But what if we have legitimate disagreements about what's appropriate? What if you want the children to participate in something we don't think is suitable, or you disagree with a parenting decision we've made? The trust language gives you a lot of power to override our judgment. Now we were getting to the heart of Sarah's objections. She was afraid that formalizing my role as grandmother would limit her authority as mother, that having to consider my perspective would constrain her ability to shape her children's experiences according to her own values and preferences. David, I'm not interested in overriding your parenting decisions. I'm interested in being consulted about decisions that affect my relationship with my grandchildren. There's a difference between having input and having control. But if we disagree with your input, what happens? According to the trust language, you could suspend our financial support if you feel we're not adequately considering your perspective. That's correct. Mom, that's essentially financial coercion. You're using money to force us to agree with you about family decisions. I felt a flare of anger at that characterization. David, I'm not forcing you to agree with me about anything. I'm offering you a choice. You can accept financial support that comes with expectations about mutual respect and family inclusion, or you can decline that support and make your own decisions without any input from me. What I'm not willing to do anymore is provide support while being treated as if my opinions and feelings are irrelevant. The conversation continued for another hour, with David presenting various compromise proposals that would give them most of the financial benefits while reducing the behavioral requirements. Sarah wanted the trust to provide support with minimal oversight, wanted me to be included in family life on her terms rather than on terms we'd negotiated together. But I'd learned too much about Sarah's negotiating style to accept half measures. Every compromise she suggested was designed to give her more wiggle room, more opportunities to gradually return to the pattern of exclusion that had brought us to this crisis. She wanted the security of my financial support, without the accountability. That would ensure my place in the family remained secure. When we finally hung up, I knew that Sarah was still hoping she could find a way to have everything she wanted. She wasn't ready to acknowledge that her previous behavior had been unacceptable, wasn't willing to accept that rebuilding trust would require her to give up some of the control she'd been exercising over my relationship with my grandchildren. The next phase of our negotiation would require a different kind of pressure. That weekend, I implemented the next stage of my strategy. I called Tommy and Emma directly, something I hadn't done since before the birthday party incident. Sarah had trained me not to reach out to them independently, to always go through her to arrange contact. But the trust documents I'd presented made it clear that direct access to my grandchildren was non-negotiable, so I decided to start exercising that right immediately. "Grandma Grace!" Tommy's voice was pure joy when he heard my voice. "Mommy? Said you were really busy and couldn't see us for a while." The casual lie hit me like a physical blow. Sarah had been telling my grandchildren that I was too busy to see them, was poisoning their understanding of why our visits had become less frequent. She was making me the villain in their story, the grandmother who had chosen other priorities, over spending time with them. "I'm never too busy for you, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Grandma has just been working out some grown-up things with Mommy and Daddy, but I would love to see you and Emma soon. Would you like to come spend the night at my house this weekend?" "Yes. Can we make cookies? And can Emma bring her new stuffed elephant?" "Of course you can. Let me talk to Mommy about the details, okay?" When Sarah came to the phone, her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Grace, you can't just call and make plans with the children without discussing it with me first." "Actually, Sarah, I can. They're my grandchildren, and maintaining a direct relationship with them is one of my fundamental rights as their grandmother. If you'd like to discuss the logistics of this weekend's visit, I'm happy to do that. But I'm not asking your permission to spend time with them." This is exactly what I was talking about when I said the trust provisions were too controlling. You're making unilateral decisions about my children's schedules. I'm making plans to see my grandchildren, something I should have been doing all along instead of waiting for you to decide when and how I was allowed to connect with them. This is what normal grandparent relationships look like, Sarah. The conversation that followed was tense and difficult, but ultimately Sarah agreed to let Tommy and Emma spend Saturday night at my house. I suspected she was testing me, trying to see if I would actually follow through on my new boundaries, or if this was just another negotiating tactic that would fade if she applied enough pressure. She was about to learn that Grace Peterson didn't bluff. That Saturday was magical. Tommy and Emma arrived at my house with an energy and enthusiasm I hadn't seen from them in months. We spent the afternoon baking chocolate chip cookies, working in the garden, and reading stories in the big armchair by the fireplace. Emma's stuffed elephant, a gray creature named Peanuts, became an honorary member of our cookie-making team. During dinner, Tommy told me about his new friend at school, a boy named Marcus who had the same dinosaur lunchbox. Emma demonstrated the new song she'd learned in preschool, complete with hand motions that involved considerable spinning and jumping. They were relaxed and happy in a way that reminded me of how our relationship used to be, before Sarah had started limiting our time together. But I also noticed changes that broke my heart. Tommy asked me 3 separate times if I was sure I wasn't too busy to spend time with them. Emma kept checking to make sure I was really listening when she told me stories, as if she'd grown accustomed to adults who were distracted or disengaged. They were both more tentative than they used to be, less confident that my attention and affection were unconditional. Sarah had damaged more than just my relationship with my grandchildren. She'd made them question whether they were truly valued and wanted, had created uncertainty where there should have been absolute security. The children were paying the price for her power struggles, were learning to doubt the stability of adult love in ways that would affect them for years to come. That night, after they'd gone to sleep in the guest room that had been designed specifically for their visits, I sat in my study and called Michael in Seattle. "How did it go?" he asked. "Wonderful and heartbreaking at the same time. They're such incredible children, but Sarah's manipulation has affected them more than I realized. They're not sure anymore whether the adults in their lives really want them around." "That's child abuse, Mom. Maybe not the kind that gets reported to social services, but it's still abuse. She's using them as weapons in her conflict with you." Michael's words crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. Sarah wasn't just excluding me from family activities. She was teaching my grandchildren that adult love was conditional, that relationships could be withdrawn without explanation, that people they depended on might suddenly become too busy or too important to maintain connections with them. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to protect them," I said. "And I'm going to make sure Sarah understands that using children as pawns in adult conflicts is completely unacceptable." Sunday morning brought new challenges. When David and Sarah arrived to pick up the children, it was clear that my overnight visit had created stress in their household. Sarah looked exhausted, and David seemed nervous about something. "How did everything go?" David asked, but he was looking at Sarah rather than at me when he said it. "Perfectly. The children were delightful, as always. We made cookies, worked in the garden, and had wonderful conversations about school and friends and their interests." "That's great," Sarah said, but her voice was strained. "Kids, did you have fun with Grandma Grace?" "We made the best cookies ever," Emma announced. "And Grandma let me pick all the flowers I wanted for the bouquet." "And we read 3 whole books before bedtime," Tommy added. "Grandma said next time we can build a fort in the backyard." I saw Sarah's jaw tighten at Tommy's mention of next. Damn. She was still hoping this would be an isolated incident, that she could contain my access to the children rather than accepting that regular independent time with them would be part of our new normal. "Speaking of next time," I said pleasantly, "I'd like to have them again next weekend. Would Saturday work for you?" "Actually, we're pretty busy next weekend," Sarah said quickly. "Tommy has a soccer game, and we were thinking of doing some family activities." "What time is Tommy's soccer game?" 2:00. "Perfect. I can pick them up after the game and have them back Sunday evening. That way you can have your family time on Saturday, and I can have mine on Sunday." "David?" And Sarah exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They weren't prepared for me to be this persistent, this specific about my expectations. Sarah had probably hoped that one overnight visit would satisfy me for a while, that I would return to the pattern of waiting for her to offer opportunities rather than creating them myself. "Grace, I think we need to slow down a little bit," Sarah said. "The children need consistency and routine, not a bunch of changes to their schedule." "I agree completely. That's why I think regular weekend visits with their grandmother should become part of their routine. Consistency is exactly what we're building here." The conversation that followed was polite but tense, with Sarah trying to maintain control over the timing and frequency of my visits, while I insisted on the kind of regular access that grandparents typically enjoyed. We eventually agreed that I would have the children every other weekend, with additional visits during school holidays and special occasions. But I could see in Sarah's expression that she viewed this as a temporary concession rather than a permanent change. She was still looking for ways to regain control, still hoping she could find a compromise that would satisfy me without fundamentally altering the power dynamic between us. She was about to learn that the power dynamic had already changed, whether she accepted it or not. Over the next few weeks, the financial pressure on David's family intensified. Without my various forms of support, they were discovering the true cost of their lifestyle. David had to take on freelance engineering projects to cover the gap in their budget. Sarah started talking about returning to work sooner than she'd planned, since Emma would be starting kindergarten in the fall anyway. More significantly, they had to make choices about Tommy and Emma's activities. The private swim lessons ended. The expensive summer camp registrations were canceled. The family vacation they'd been planning to Disney World was quietly shelved. Each of these changes was painful for the children, who didn't understand why opportunities they'd been promised were suddenly unavailable. Tommy was particularly upset about missing camp, since several of his friends were attending and he'd been looking forward to it for months. I heard about these difficulties through my weekend visits with the children, through casual comments they made about changes in their routine and disappointments in their plans. I also heard about them through David, who called me twice during this period to update me on their family's financial adjustments. "Mom, we're managing," he said during one of these calls. "But it's harder than I expected. I didn't realize how much of our lifestyle was dependent on your support." "How is Sarah handling the adjustments?" There was a long pause. "She's struggling. She feels like she's failing the children, like she's not able to provide them with the opportunities they deserve. She's also angry that you're not stepping in to help with specific things like Tommy's camp." "David, I'd be happy to help with Tommy's camp. The trust structure I presented includes provisions for educational and recreational activities. If Sarah is willing to work within that framework, many of these financial pressures could be relieved. She says the framework is too restrictive, too controlling. Then she's choosing financial independence over financial support. That's her right, but it comes with consequences." These conversations were difficult for David, who was caught between his loyalty to his wife and his understanding of what I was offering. He could see that accepting the trust provisions would solve most of their immediate financial problems, but he also understood that Sarah viewed those provisions as an unacceptable limitation on her autonomy as a mother. What David didn't fully grasp yet was that Sarah's objection wasn't really about parental autonomy. It was about maintaining the power to exclude me when convenient, while keeping the option to include me when beneficial. She wanted a relationship where she set all the terms, and I accepted whatever role she assigned to me. The crisis came to a head during the third week of this new arrangement. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was reading in my study when the phone rang with an urgency that cut through the quiet of my house. It was David, his voice tight with stress and exhaustion. "Mom, we need to talk. Can you come over tonight?" "What's wrong?" Can you come over, please?" I drove to David's house through the late evening darkness, my mind racing through possible scenarios. When I arrived, I could see through the windows that both children were already in bed, but the lights were on throughout the downstairs. David met me at the door, his face haggard in a way that made him look older than his 34 years. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and documents, her eyes red from crying. When she looked up at me, I saw something I'd never seen before in her expression. Defeat. "Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to accept your terms." I sat down across from her, studying the documents spread across the table. Bank statements, bills, budget worksheets, employment applications, the full scope of their financial reality, laid out in black and white. "What's changed?" I asked. "Everything," David said, slumping into the chair next to his wife. "We ran the numbers, really ran them, trying to figure out how to make this work on our own. And we can't. Not without major changes that would affect the children's quality of life." Sarah pushed a spreadsheet across the table to me. "We'd have to sell the house and move to a smaller place in a different school district. Tommy would have to leave his school and his friends. We'd have to cut most of their activities, cancel. Their educational programs basically downsize their entire childhood." I looked at the numbers, seeing the careful calculations they'd made, the various scenarios they'd considered. They'd been thorough and realistic, had faced the mathematical reality of their situation without the cushion my support had provided. "And you've decided that's not acceptable?" It's not fair to the children, Sarah said, her voice breaking. They didn't choose this situation. They shouldn't have to pay the price for my mistakes. There it was, finally. An acknowledgement that mistakes had been made, that the current crisis wasn't just the result of unfortunate circumstances, but of choices Sarah had made about how to treat me and what risks she was willing to take with her family's security. What mistakes, Sarah? She looked at me directly for the first time since I'd arrived, tears streaming down her face. I tried to cut you out of our lives because I was jealous and insecure, and I risked my children's future because I was too proud to admit what I was doing was wrong. The admission hung in the air between us, raw and honest in a way that none of our previous conversations had been. Sarah had finally acknowledged the truth about her behavior, had stopped hiding behind rationalizations about boundaries and nuclear families. Tell me more about the jealousy and insecurity. Sarah wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. The children love you so much, and they're so excited to see you, and they talk about you constantly. When Tommy started school, his teacher asked him to draw a picture of his family, and he included you before he included me. When Emma has nightmares, she asks for you. When they get hurt, they want Grandma Grace's special Band-Aids. And how did that make you feel? Like I wasn't enough, like I was failing as a mother, like they'd rather have you than me. The words came out in a rush, years of hidden resentment finally being voiced. I worked so hard to be a good mom, to do everything right, but they still preferred their grandmother. It made me feel like I was competing for my own children's affection. I felt a deep sadness for Sarah, for the pain she'd been carrying and the destructive ways she'd chosen to handle it. But I also felt validation for my own experience, confirmation that my sense of being deliberately excluded hadn't been paranoia or oversensitivity. So you decided to limit their access to me. I thought if they spent less time with you, they'd appreciate me more. I thought if I could create some distance between you and them, they'd bond with me the way they bonded with you. Sarah's voice was barely audible now. But it didn't work. It just made them sad and confused, and it made you pull away from all of us. Sarah, love isn't a zero-sum game. The children's affection for me doesn't diminish their love for you. You're their mother. That's a bond that can't be replaced or threatened by anyone else, including me. I know that now, she whispered. But I didn't know it then. And I was so afraid of losing them that I almost lost everything. The vulnerability in Sarah's voice was something I'd never heard before, and it changed everything about how I understood our entire relationship. For months, I'd been analyzing her behavior through the lens of power and control, viewing her actions as calculated moves in some kind of family chess game. But sitting across from her now, watching her finally admit the fear and insecurity that had driven her choices, I realized that I'd been fighting the wrong battle entirely. Sarah, I said gently, you could never lose Tommy and Emma. You're their mother. That's not a position anyone can take from you, no matter how much they love their grandmother. She shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. But you were so good with them. So natural. You knew exactly what to say when they were upset, exactly what games they wanted to play, exactly how to make them laugh. I felt like I was constantly struggling to figure out what they needed, while everything came so easily to you. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on me. Sarah was describing the very qualities that had made me want to be involved in my grandchildren's lives, the joy I found in understanding their personalities and needs. But she'd experienced those same qualities as a threat rather than a gift. Sweetheart, I have 40 years of experience being a mother, and Tommy and Emma are my third and fourth grandchildren if you count Michael's future family. What feels natural to you is actually the result of decades of practice, of making mistakes and learning from them, of developing patience through necessity. David was watching this conversation with the fascination of someone seeing his wife clearly for the first time. "Sarah, you never told me you felt this way. I thought you were just trying to establish boundaries." "I was too ashamed to admit it," Sarah said. "What kind of mother is jealous of her children's grandmother? What kind of person tries to limit her kid's relationship with someone who loves them just because she feels insecure?" This was the heart of it, the shame that had driven Sarah to rationalize her behavior rather than address the underlying emotions. She'd been too proud to admit that she felt threatened by my relationship with Tommy and Emma, so she'd created elaborate justifications about nuclear families and appropriate boundaries. "Sarah, insecurity about parenting is completely normal," I said. "Every mother questions whether she's doing enough, whether her children are happy, whether she's measuring up to some impossible standard. The difference is how you choose to handle those feelings." "I handled them terribly. I made you the enemy instead of recognizing that you were trying to help. I convinced myself that you were overstepping boundaries when really you were just being a loving grandmother." As Sarah continued to speak, a fuller picture of her experience began to emerge. She'd grown up in a family where her own grandparents had been distant and formal, where intergenerational relationships were polite, but not particularly warm. She'd had no model for the kind of engaged, hands-on grandmother I wanted to be. When Tommy and Emma responded to my involvement with such enthusiasm, Sarah had interpreted their excitement as evidence that she wasn't meeting their needs adequately. Instead of seeing my relationship with them as supplementary to her role as their mother, she'd viewed it as competition. "The worst part," Sarah admitted, "was that I could see how much you loved them and how much they loved you. Part of me was grateful that they had that relationship, but a bigger part of me resented it. I wanted to be enough for them by myself." "But Sarah, you are enough. Look at what wonderful children they are. How kind and thoughtful and curious. That's your influence, your daily care and attention, your values being instilled in them. My weekend visits and special treats can't create the foundation of character that you're building every single day." David reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. "Honey, why didn't you talk to me about this? We could have worked through these feelings together." "Because I was embarrassed, and because I knew how much you valued your mother's involvement with the kids. I didn't want to seem petty or jealous, so I tried to handle it by gradually creating more distance. I thought if I did it subtly enough, no one would notice what was happening." "But I did notice," I said. "And instead of understanding that you were struggling with something, I interpreted your actions as deliberate attempts to exclude me. I responded to your insecurity with my own power plays, which only made the situation worse. This was my moment of revelation, the recognition that I'd been so focused on protecting my position that I'd failed to see the pain behind Sarah's behavior. Yes, she'd been wrong to handle her insecurity by limiting my access to my grandchildren. But I'd been equally wrong to respond with financial manipulation instead of trying to understand what was really happening. "Grace, I'm so sorry," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I hurt you, and I know I confused and upset the children. I was so focused on my own fears that I couldn't see how my actions were affecting everyone else." "And I'm sorry too," I replied. "I should have recognized that you were struggling and tried to address the underlying issues instead of just fighting the symptoms. I should have been more thoughtful about how my involvement might feel to you as a new mother." David was looking back and forth between us, his expression shifting from relief to concern. "So where does this leave us? Can we find a way forward that works for everyone?" This was the crucial question, the one that would determine whether our family could heal from the damage we'd inflicted on each other. Sarah had finally acknowledged the real motivations behind her behavior, and I'd recognized my own role in escalating the conflict. But awareness alone wouldn't solve our problems. We needed to create new patterns of interaction that addressed everyone's needs. "I think we need to start over," I said. "Not by pretending the past few months didn't happen but by using what we've learned to build something better. What would that look like? Sarah asked. It would mean establishing clear expectations and boundaries that protect everyone's important relationships. It would mean regular communication about concerns before they become crises. And it would mean accepting that family relationships require ongoing attention and adjustment as circumstances change. Over the next hour, we began sketching out a new framework for our family dynamic. Instead of the formal trust structure I'd presented, we agreed to create a more flexible arrangement that provided financial support while ensuring regular communication about family decisions that affected my relationship with Tommy and Emma. Sarah agreed to include me in major family events and to maintain consistent opportunities for me to spend time with the children. But more importantly, she agreed to communicate directly with me when she felt overwhelmed or threatened by my involvement, rather than trying to manage her discomfort by limiting my access. I agreed to be more mindful of Sarah's role as the children's primary caregiver, to consult with her before making plans that affected their routine, and to support her authority as their mother, rather than inadvertently undermining it. There's something else we need to address, I said as our conversation began to wind down. The children have been affected by all of this tension and uncertainty. They need to understand that the changes in our family dynamic weren't their fault, and they need reassurance that all the adults in their lives are committed to maintaining stable, loving relationships with them. Sarah nodded emphatically. Tommy has been asking why you seemed sad the last few times you visited, and Emma keeps asking if Grandma Grace still loves her. I've been trying to reassure them, but I think they need to hear from you directly that none of this was about them. And they need to see us working together as a family, David added. They need evidence that we can resolve conflicts and move forward rather than just enduring ongoing tension. We decided that our first step would be a family meeting with Tommy and Emma, age-appropriate but honest, where we would acknowledge that there had been some adult disagreements that were now resolved. We would emphasize that all the grown-ups loved them very much and were committed to making sure they felt secure and valued. As I prepared to leave that evening, Sarah walked me to the door. The woman who had seemed so confident and controlled just months earlier now looked younger somehow, more vulnerable, but also more genuine. Grace, there's one more thing I need to say. All the financial support you provided over the years, all the ways you helped our family without us even realizing it, I never properly acknowledged how generous that was, how much thought and care went into making our lives easier. I took it for granted, and that was wrong of me. Sarah, I gave that support freely because I love this family. But you're right that it should have been acknowledged rather than invisible. Going forward, I'd like us to be more open about the ways we help each other, so that appreciation and gratitude can be part of our family culture. I'd like that too. And Grace, I want you to know that I really do want Tommy and Emma to have a close relationship with you. I was so caught up in my own insecurities that I lost sight of how much value you bring to their lives. They're lucky to have a grandmother who loves them as much as you do. The drive home that night was quiet and reflective. I thought about the complexity of family relationships, the ways that love and fear can become entangled, the difficulty of maintaining multiple important relationships without feeling like you're competing for limited resources. Sarah's revelation had forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about my own behavior. Yes, she had been wrong to exclude me from family activities and to limit my access to my grandchildren. But I had also been wrong to assume malicious intent rather than investigating the underlying causes of her actions. I had wielded my financial power like a weapon, using the trust structure and withdrawal of support to force compliance rather than seeking understanding. I had been so focused on winning the immediate battle that I'd nearly sacrificed the long-term health of our family relationships. The next few weeks brought gradual healing and adjustment. Sarah and I began having regular coffee meetings, informal conversations where we could discuss family matters and address concerns before they became problems. She shared more about her experiences as a mother, the challenges she faced, and the victories she celebrated. I shared more about my perspective as a grandmother, the joy I found in my relationship with Tommy and Emma, and the ways I hoped to contribute to their development. Tommy and Emma responded to the changed atmosphere with visible relief. The tension that had characterized family gatherings for months began to dissipate, replaced by a more natural flow of conversation and interaction. They stopped asking careful questions about whether adults were happy or sad, stopped walking on eggshells around emotional topics. David flourished in this new environment as well, no longer caught between his loyalty to his wife and his love. For his mother, he was able to engage with both relationships authentically. He began facilitating conversations between Sarah and me when needed, but he also stepped back from the mediator role that had been exhausting him for months. The financial support was gradually restored, but in a more transparent way that allowed David and Sarah to understand and appreciate the assistance they were receiving. Instead of secret payments and anonymous gifts, we created a family budget that included my contributions as a visible line item. This approach preserved their dignity while ensuring that my generosity was acknowledged rather than taken for granted. Most importantly, my relationship with Tommy and Emma was restored to its previous warmth and consistency. Regular weekend visits resumed, along with participation in school events, birthday parties, and holiday celebrations. But now these interactions happened within a framework of mutual respect and clear communication rather than the underlying tension that had characterized our family dynamic for so many months. 6 months after that crucial evening conversation, we gathered for Tommy's 6th birthday party. This time, when the photographer was ready to take family pictures, Sarah made a point of ensuring I was included in every shot. But more than that, she made sure I knew I was welcome, that my presence was valued rather than merely tolerated. As I watched my family laughing and celebrating together, I reflected on the lessons we'd all learned through this difficult period. Sarah had learned that insecurity and fear, left unaddressed, could lead to destructive behavior that hurt everyone she loved most. David had learned the importance of addressing family conflicts directly, rather than hoping they would resolve themselves. And I had learned that power, even when used with good intentions, was a poor substitute for understanding and communication. The trust documents remained unsigned, filed away in Richard Patterson's office as a reminder of how close we'd come to permanent damage. Instead, we'd chosen a different path, one based on ongoing dialogue and mutual respect rather than legal enforcement of behavioral expectations. Our family emerged from this crisis stronger, but also wiser. We'd learned that love alone wasn't enough to sustain healthy relationships. We also needed empathy, communication, and the courage to address difficult emotions before they poisoned our connections with each other. As Tommy blew out his birthday candles and made his wish, I found myself hoping that our family's hard-won wisdom would serve us well in the years to come. We'd proven that even serious conflicts could be resolved when people were willing to be honest about their fears and mistakes. We'd demonstrated that families could rebuild trust and create new patterns of interaction when everyone was committed to the work required. Most importantly, we'd learned that the bonds between generations are too precious to be sacrificed to pride or fear. Tommy and Emma deserved to grow up knowing they were surrounded by adults who loved them enough to work through their differences, who valued family relationships enough to do the hard work of understanding and forgiveness. The photographs from that birthday party tell a story of genuine joy and connection, of a family that had faced a serious crisis and emerged intact. When I look at those pictures now, I see not just smiling faces, but evidence of our commitment to each other, proof that love guided by wisdom and humility can overcome even the most challenging circumstances. Sarah had been right about one thing. Families do need boundaries and respect for different roles. But she'd been wrong about how to establish those boundaries. The answer wasn't exclusion or competition. It was communication and collaboration, working together to create space for everyone to contribute their unique gifts to the family's well-being. As for me, I'd learned that being a family matriarch meant more than just providing financial support or maintaining traditions. It meant modeling the kind of grace and wisdom that helps families navigate difficult times. demonstrating that strength and vulnerability could coexist, showing that even well-intentioned people sometimes need to admit their mistakes and choose a better path forward. The Peterson Family Trust Fund was eventually restructured, but not as a tool of control or coercion. Instead, it became a vehicle for teaching Tommy and Emma about family values, about the importance of using resources wisely and treating relationships with care. The real legacy I wanted to leave wasn't just financial security, but the knowledge that families can overcome almost any challenge when they approach each other with honesty, empathy, and love. In the end, the battle over family photographs had taught us all something invaluable: that the most important pictures aren't the ones that hang on our walls, but the memories we create through our daily choices to prioritize understanding over being right, connection over control, and love over fear. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.